Hi, everyone. Very excited to be here. Thank you for sticking around to listen to my talk. All right, let's get started. Okay, so once upon a time, Africa wasn't known as like one of the places where tech is bubbling or happening, right? Of course, we had software engineers in different African countries, but the prevailing fields at the time were still medicine and surgery, law, and banking. In fact, if you had a conversation with your parents about wanting to have like a career in tech or being a software engineer, some of them would be like, okay, no, I don't think you should do this. Like, it's not a good path, stick with being one of these things. While others would literally threaten to disown you or stop paying for your education if you did not become one of the big three, which was a medical doctor, a lawyer, or a banker. But that has changed. It's no longer the case anymore. Africa has become that continent where there's a lot of people in tech. Tech is now one of the big three, right? So parents are now encouraging people to also start a career in tech. They will even buy a laptop for you. But before, if they see you pressing a laptop, they're like, why are you doing this thing? Go and do something more productive, right? But that concept has now changed. So today, I'll be taking you on a journey of how Africa moved from a continent where not a lot of people knew about what open source meant, right? To becoming that continent where we have active open source contributors, people building open source projects. I will talk about what triggered that shift, right? What moved it from not being that continent to becoming the continent. Some of the things that we've learned and how, or what we believe is the next phase of open source in Africa. Hi, can you please increase the slides down here so I can see clearer, because I'm short-sighted. Even with my glasses, I can't see. All right, while he's still trying to do that, my name is Edidiong Asikpo. Throughout my life, I've lived in like different places from like where I come from, so I know that my name is quite hard to pronounce, so you can call me Didi. It's like a short version of Edidiong. I am a senior developer advocate and technical content creator. No, actually, I need the slides, not the word, like the slides here to be big. Cool, thank you. All right, cool. I'm a software and senior developer advocate and technical content creator, and I'm also a community manager at Open Source Community Africa. I go by Didi Codes on all my social media platforms except LinkedIn, which is a combination of my first and last name, Edidiong Asikpo. So remember I said I was taking you on a journey, right? So let's talk about how it all started. So the educational system in Nigeria is designed in such a way that if you're studying to have like any science degree like medicine, surgery, or computer science, you'd have to go for this thing called an industrial training to be able to get real life experience, right? So think of an industrial training as an internship, so to speak. But the difference here is it lasts for 6 months, and you must do it at a company that is in line with the course you're trying to study. So if you're studying to become a medical doctor, when you go for this industrial training, you'd have to work at a hospital, right? Something like that. The whole concept is to help you understand what life would be like when you eventually graduate. This happens in your 3rd year in college, and then you go for 6 months, and then you come back and then do your final year before you graduate from college. So since I studied computer science, I went to this company called Start Innovation Hub, and I would spend the next 6 months here learning how to develop Android applications. One of the amazing things about this company was that, again, Google, Facebook, Microsoft, all of them were trying to build a presence in Africa. So they would always partner with the CEO of this company to host several tech events, right? And because I was working in this company, I would have access to these events without necessarily having to register. I mean, it's just like going to work and, oh, there's an event happening, and I would join that event. So during one of these events, the speaker who was talking about JavaScript would mention open source in passing, more like, oh, this is an open source language, and just give a brief context about what it meant. And I thought it was very fascinating, but I never really got to look into it after the talk. I only came here to learn how to develop Android applications so that when I go back to school, I would make my lecturers proud and get an A in my course, right? It was very school-focused. But luckily for me, during the next GDG event, which is Google Developer Groups, that happened toward the end of the year, because we typically had this event where everybody in a certain region that had GDG communities would join together and have like one big one. I would have another speaker talk about open source. But this speaker would talk about it in detail, like the meaning of open source, how to actually contribute to open source, the impact it would have on your career if you contributed, and a lot more. And this would actually make me think, hey, okay, I think I'm actually going to give this thing a shot. This speaker was Samson Gadi. Samson and I would eventually connect on Facebook, and I would reach out to him to ask him questions about open source because I was very interested in contributing at the time. He would recommend that I try the Google Summer of Code program since I was still in college. That was like the best route to take. And I will find this organization called ODK, which is Open Data Kit, right? This would lead me to making my first open source contribution, creating a pull request, and the pull request would eventually get merged, leading to one of the best days of my life. Who can remember the first time they made an open source contribution that was merged? Were you excited? Were you excited? Okay. Okay. So it was so exciting for me. Like, I could not believe that the code contribution that I made was merged into an organization and a product that were used by thousands of people. One of the best days of my life, really. So why am I telling you this, you may be wondering? It's because, like myself, not a lot of people knew about open source. Yes, tech was beginning to boom in Africa, but people were pretty much focused on, hey, I need to learn this language, I need to do this thing to be able to build my career. There were tech events happening, but it was mostly led by certain, like Google and Facebook, so it was very much centered around their products, right, and trying to establish themselves in Africa. But over time, this changed. Something happened that drastically moved the people in Nigeria and eventually other African countries to become active open source contributors. And what is that thing, you may ask? It was the launch of Open Source Community Africa in 2018 by Samson Gadi and Ada Nduka-Oyom. This organization was launched to increase the awareness about open source in Africa, increase the number of open source contributors from Africa, and increase the number of open source projects created by Africans. When this community first launched in 2018, we would have this first event in Port Harcourt, which is a state in Africa, in Nigeria, sorry. And then in 2019, we would have 3 more open source events in Uyo, Lagos, and Port Harcourt as well. And then the number of people who attend this meetups were about like 20 to 50 to 80, a good number for a start, but we wanted more, right? Because our goal was to increase the awareness of open source in Africa, increase the projects that were created, and also increase contributions. And we knew we couldn't do this with just like 20 or 80 or 50 people. Even though we were excited, at least we had those numbers. So we decided to try something different. We said, fine, let's host an open source festival. That this festival is going to last for about 3 days. It would have talks, workshops, panel sessions, and it would be solely focused on open source. At the time we tried to do this, nothing like that had ever been done in any African country. Of course, we would have like big events, like I mentioned, from like Facebook, Google, Microsoft, and the rest of them, but it was always just focused on those events themselves. There was never really an event around open source or having any of those conversations. So we'll come together, create a team, and that would lead to the first ever open source festival in Nigeria in 2020. This festival would have about 800 people, lots of talks happening, lots of workshops, so many sponsors like Google, remember Facebook Open Source, GitHub, and several other people that I would not have the time to mention. We'd have amazing speakers like Errol Fox, Anyedi, Prosper Otemuyiwa, Stephen Wiley, Henry, and so many other amazing speakers. This festival would serve as one of the big shifts that moves Africans from not knowing about open source to knowing about it. Like I mentioned, it was a 3-day festival. So the first day was focused on workshops. We didn't just want to tell people, oh, hey, this is open source, this is what it is. We wanted to show people how to actually contribute. So these workshops were centered around educating people, showing people how to make their first open source contributions. Well, on the second and third day, we'd have panel sessions, talks from different speakers that were invited to speak at the event. One of the panel sessions was around open source programs, right? Like the Google Summer of Code, the Google Season of Dogs, the Outreachy. At the time, there were barely Africans that were accepted into these programs. Maybe 1, 2, sometimes even none. And we wanted to change that narrative. We wanted to change the Africans being represented in these places. So we had a panel session where some of the people who had been accepted that were Africans would come to share like their journey, how they got accepted, what they did differently, and of course how this stuff would change their career, right? You can see a couple of people there like Samson, myself, Perry, and Amanda who facilitated the panel session. Another talk that was very impactful was this talk by Prosper Otemuyiwa titled tiny changes, remarkable results. He would talk about how making small changes over time can amount to something big, like your first open source contribution, which would seem like, oh my God, this is such a small thing or this is such a big thing. But if you continue to make open source contributions over time, it would amount to changing your career or having lots of impact on people. He would use Henry's story as an example, how Henry made his first contribution to Angola, proceeded to make other open source contributions, like fixing some of the issues in the Khan Academy repos. And because of all of these contributions that he would make, he would end up landing a job at Behance and eventually becoming the maintainer of Babel, which is one of amazing open source products. And one very interesting thing was that Henry was also one of the speakers on this day. So he would then come to share his own story about open source and just cement like the whole concept of being able to make a small change consistently, which would now result in something huge. This would leave attendees inspired, excited, and ready to make their first open source contribution. Aside from the festival, another thing that also helped to create that change in the open source space was the launch of the Chapter Leads program. When OSCA first happened in 2020, we realized that most of the attendees and participants of this event and OSCA in general were mostly Nigerians. And we're like, our community name is Open Source Community Africa, not Open Source Community Nigeria. So we wanted to do something different. We wanted to reach more people in other African countries. And then there's always this concept where people post, oh, hey, I'm going to Africa, or I'm going somewhere, thinking that Africa is like a country, but no, there are several other countries in Africa. So yes, we didn't just want to fix it like Nigeria. We wanted to reach as many African countries as we could. So we decided, okay, cool. We can't do this by ourselves. We're only a number of people, right, in Nigeria. We need to create something else. So we created a Chapter Leads program that had several people in different African countries who were doing well in terms of building communities to come together and build sub-chapters of OSCAs in these different communities. So OSCA would move from just having presence in 3 states in Nigeria to now having 3 chapters in about 9 countries in Africa. And then this is going to help to create more awareness about open source, not just in Nigeria, where OSCA was pretty much active in the first part, but in different African countries as well. So the big shift that happened was more of a combination of the Open Source Festival and the Chapter Leads program. And this will go further to create several success stories, use cases, and some of which I'm going to mention today. So in the report from Octoverse in 2020, you'd see that Nigeria became the top most country that had more people contributing to open source, being active in GitHub and the open source space, which is testament of the Open Source Festival that happened earlier in 2020, which was around in February, if I'm not mistaken. So the number of people contributing to open source drastically moved, taking Nigeria to the top spot. And in 2023, in this Octoverse report again, you'd see that, of course, the number was still growing, but it wasn't just Nigeria this time. We had Kenya and a couple of other African countries, which speaks to the testament of moving OSCA from being just active in Nigeria to these other African countries. Another story here is one of the attendees, Uche, who attended Open Source Festival in 2020. He would talk about how when he came to this festival, he didn't really have a lot of he didn't know anything about open source. He didn't really have a lot of impact in his career, but he would leave the festival excited about open source, ready to make contributions, network with a lot of people. And before he knew it, Uche made his first open source contribution, continued to make further open source contributions, which would then land him in the LFX mentorship program. And these different contributions and activeness in the open source community would give him his first full-time role at Grafana Labs, where he would work as a full-time open source engineer, which he tied his experience and career fulfillment to coming to that one festival, and that things would have not been the same if he did not attend the festival to learn about open source or contributing. Another instance here is the outreach program. Like I mentioned, in 2019, for instance, I was the only African to be accepted into the Google Season of Docs program. So when we did this panel session in 2020, we wanted to bring in more people. So someone who got accepted at Google Summer of Code, Outreach, we all had a conversation about it, like I showed you in the previous slide. And you can see here in this tweet made from someone in 2022, you'd see that this number drastically increased. Like you'd say, from the number of, it was about 65 people that were accepted into the Outreach internship, and out of that 55, there was a large number, about 25 that were Nigerians, and then excluding Nigerians from it, about 55 of those people were accepted were Africans. Like I mentioned, if you go to outreach and look at the stats from, like, let's say 2018 or 2019, you probably just see one black person there, or like one African or one Nigerian there, but this number increased over time. In the first festival in 2020, we had about 800 people attend OSCA Fest. In the most recent one we had last year in 2023, this number increased to about like 2,000 plus people attending OSCA Fest. This shows the growth and the conversations that are now happening in Africa as compared to how it used to be before the first festival in 2020. So aside from increasing awareness, increasing the number of open source contributors, we also wanted to increase the projects that were created by Africans, right? And you see that we now had projects like Chakra UI, which is a UI component for the React applications. We had Dabo.js, which is used to manipulate data. It's a JavaScript library. And then also have things like the Nuru programming language, which is created using Swahili, which is a language in Africa. And there are other repos like the Made in Nigeria, Made in Ghana repo, which combines different projects created by Nigerians or Ghanaians, depending on the country, into a particular repo, right? So seeing that the number of projects created by Africans had also increased. So if you look at the goal, the things we had, right? We wanted to increase awareness, wanted to increase contributors, also wanted to increase projects. And I feel like we achieved this goal, some more than others, right? Some very well, others relatively. So in terms of awareness, you'd see that we moved from having 800 participants at our event to about 2,000 plus, right? Our community members on our Discord channel increased from like 1,000 to about 4,400. And the presence in countries was actually one when we first started, that is just Nigeria. But we then increased to about 9 countries. And in these 9 countries, we would have about 34 chapters, right? So, like you know, one country has several states, right? So there could be OSCA presence in different states in this country. And then we'd also have been able to host about 5 Sustain Africa events. So Sustain Africa is pretty much talking about how we can sustain open source in Africa. So much more than that, right? We knew that, fine, I think we've clocked in terms of like the awareness on the contributions, but we also really want to increase the number of projects, open source projects, created by Africans. So one of the things we're trying to do, this program hasn't launched yet, but we'll do soon, is the IDB program, which means Ideate, Design, Build. And the whole concept of this is to bring in participants to participate in like a mentorship program, so to speak, that would last for like 3 to 6 months, and then they will get to experience what it would feel like to actually be in the ideation, designing, and development of an open source project. So at the end of this program, it means we'd have more open source projects created by Africans, and more Africans who understand and are participating in like a collaborative process on working on an open source project. So aside from OSCA, there are several other people who have played a huge part in increasing or creating awareness about open source in Africa. And it would be unrealistic for me to end this and say, hey, it's just OSCA. OSCA did everything. That's not entirely true. So I want to highlight some of these people. For instance, Marilyn, who was the first ever African to be accepted as a vice chair for the Python Software Foundation. She would go further to host the first PyCon event in Africa, and she's also one of the really strong advocates of open source in Africa. Or Adewale Abati, also known as Ace Kid, who created the Made in Nigeria repository. He would inspire other people in African countries to also create their own made in repos, like let's say Made in Ghana or Made in Cameroon, showcasing the different open source projects created by these people. Or Peace Ojeme, who we oftentimes call Perry, you might know her as Perry. Prior to the time, people always thought that open source contributions were only about people who were software engineers. Perry, as a designer, would come in to change that perspective and try to show people that you do not have to be a software engineer to be able to contribute to open source. Even with the festivals that we hosted, all of the designs that came from the festival was a group of open source designers who came together to build and create these different designs. And if you have some time to look at it, some of the designs that were created were fantastic and amazing. Or Prosper Otemuyiwa, while most of us were still trying to get up our career and try to figure out how to be in tech, Prosper was already creating libraries, was already creating stuff that was trending more than Facebook and Google on GitHub. Prosper is one of the fundamental people who has been advocating for open source and tech in Nigeria. So some of these people, I couldn't mention everyone, but these are some people who did amazing stuff in regards to open source outside of OSCA. So how can I go back? Okay. So in conclusion, you can do great things from a small place. So when OSCA started, it just started in a small city in Nigeria trying to create more awareness about open source. But over the next few years, it will become one of the most fundamental things that moved the African continent from not being aware or actively participating in the open source ecosystem to being one of the most active continents in the world participating and trying to continue improving in regards to open source. We still have a lot of work to do. If you want to be involved in what's happening in Africa, feel free to reach out to me on Twitter and LinkedIn or send me an email. Samson is also here as well, so you can reach out to either of us here to have a conversation. Thank you very much.